Welcome back. Moving on from our last video, we'd ended up with a population that was stable, large, and without very many differences occurring year on year in the population and the gene pool. And that population satisfied these criteria: a large one, random mating rather than selective, and therefore no natural selection, choosing any particular phenotype over another for survival and reproduction, very little effect of organisms coming in or going out of the population, and not much of a mutation rate in order to create new phenotypes for natural selection to act on. So let's have a look at the math of this, and this is the Weinberg equations. And the Weinberg equations are pretty useful in considering what happens to the frequency of alleles in a population. And let's have a look at the classic sort of dominant recessive sorts of alleles. We have a dominant and we have a recessive. And we'll look at those as time goes on, but we'll first look at some very, very obvious ideas and some very basic algebra. And so Hardy and Weinberg came up with this idea that they could make two equations, and from that they could work out the frequency of the dominant and the recessive alleles in a population, and they could also work out the frequency of all of the possible genotypes, whether it be homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. And this is how they did it, and it's pretty simple logic. So the idea is that there's two different types of alleles, and just to allow for the idea of codominant or partial dominance, we got the idea of P plus Q equals 1. All right, so we're looking at the idea of probability. All of the genes together, all of the alleles, add up to 1, and here's one type, such as the dominant capital A, and here's the other type, such as the recessive lowercase a. And that's pretty obvious. So when you add up all the alleles, it ends up to be the whole population of alleles, otherwise known as 1. But breeding needs two individuals, and we can put those two individuals together like this. All right. The total population of alleles is still 1. The total population of all the organisms is 1. But what happens if we put these two individuals together? We get p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1, simply by multiplying out those two sets of brackets. And then here's the quite clever bit. P squared, ends up being the population of homozygous dominant. Here's your 2pq, and that ends up being the capital A small a, the heterozygous, and the q squared then equals q squared. It equals small a. And we've got this situation, you know what it's like with your Punnett square. It's like this when you multiply these out, and of course you get your quarter of them in the ideal mating being homozygous dominant, a quarter of them being homozygous recessive, and of course a half of them, or 2 out of the 4, being heterozygous. Okay, so there are the two equations. P plus Q equals 1, and P squared plus 2pq equals Q squared. We'll have a look how to use those in the next video.